Let's then move on to Representative Chippendale's bill, which is House Bill 5705. Representative.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. As some of you may recall, this past election cycle, there was an abnormality that occurred that did grab some attention and also did cause some issues for cities and towns. Just to recount it briefly, a city in Rhode Island advertised early voting, using those words, early voting, when in fact Rhode Island does not have early voting. There is no mechanism in our law for early voting. We do have emergency voting, and our standard to allow people to vote using that mechanism is extremely low. So you have 20 days before an election to say, I need to vote in an emergency capacity, and you don't really have to even justify why. And you can vote in an election as if you were there election day. I think that's extremely important to have that mechanism there for people. But what this bill seeks to do is it seeks to add continuity to the General Assembly and the executive branch of the state's decision some years ago to add an identification process to the voting process. When you show up at the booth, and we did this incrementally, as you all know, the form of ID changed over the years and got up to the state ID or the state license, etc. When you show up to vote, you have to prove who you are. You show your ID, and you vote. There was obviously it was a controversial issue, but again, this body, with all its due diligence and good work, saw fit to pass that bill. There was a need for that bill, for that voter identification law. What happened this year was people were showing up at town halls, and I'll speak to my district. In one town, it was 150% increase. I'm sorry, a 250% increase in voters seeking to vote early, emergency ballots. And in the other town, it was 150% increase in voters seeking to vote early. What that did to these two small towns was inundated the town hall in the days prior to the election while they were trying to prepare for election day with people who wanted to quote unquote vote early because they saw it on the news. They heard it on the news. It was kicked around. This bill simply says if you choose that mechanism, as in any other mechanism, you still need to provide evidence that you are who you say you are. So if you wanted to apply for an emergency ballot, you would do so, but you would have to follow the laws of the state of Rhode Island relative to IDs required for voting. Now, this bill adds the language, which is pretty, the language, as you know, is underlined and identified in each chapter or each section where it goes, and it's pretty much the same language in each. The only area where we felt it was prudent, after speaking with some highly respected members of the House, some of whom are on this committee, Dr. Corvese, Representative Corvese, etc., that we did not want to put this requirement on folks who are either in a hospital or in long-term care or elder care, where perhaps they voted right from their bed. We didn't want to continue that requirement because that was specifically carved out when the voter ID law was passed. This, what I view as an oversight, allows people, if they're inclined, to specifically get around a requirement that this state obviously thought was important enough to put in place with the voter ID law. So were we trying to prevent something with that law? Folks who want to perpetrate that law by not having to prove they are who they are simply just don't go to the polls. They can just now go to a town hall and say, I want to use an emergency ballot. They do not have to prove who they are. They have to show no identification. They simply get the ballot, fill it out, and it goes in. Nothing is checked. So when you go, if you, as I'm sure you all do, when you visit sick constituents and they want to vote by absentee ballot, you have to validate that that person is who they say they are. I'm not going to take somebody's word, and a notary who has to sign with two witnesses isn't going to take someone's word that that person's who they are. They're going to need to know. But we don't again, in the emergency voting mechanism. We don't have any requirement for IDs. So it has been suggested, and I don't disagree, that a proper early voting mechanism should be created in the state, and I believe that there is legislation that seeks to do that. Of course, I would be in support of that as long as the identification requirements are still intact. Again, I believe this is a loophole. I believe people who may want to avoid showing an identification card to vote would choose the emergency ballot system over the standard election day wait in line and cast your ballot. I could go on and on, but I won't.
I think we get the flavor of it. Any questions for Representative Chippendale? Thank you, Representative.
Thank you very much.
Could we hear from Randall Rose, Tom Beresford, and Stephen Brown from the ACLU? Randall, whenever you're ready, you can get us started.
Yes,
the first one I just saw Stephen Brown a
Okay,
moment ago.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This bill has to do with voter ID, which is, of course, a very controversial topic, and there are important issues on both sides. On the one hand, voter ID makes it a little more certain that people voting are, in fact, eligible to vote. On the other hand, it means that it's going to be hard for a lot of people to vote. And particularly, it's hard for people who have been retired for a long time and don't get out much and don't have much of an ID because people's IDs expire. If you're retired and you spend most of your time at home, you're not going to have an up-to-date ID the way that most people who are working age do. So it is actually going to be seriously inconvenient for a number of people, and a number of people and if a number of people are required to show ID to vote and do not have an ID, they may choose not to vote, which I think would be a pretty bad outcome. Basically, there are issues on both sides, and you have to weigh which concern is the most important one. And in doing that, it makes sense to look at how often does this kind of voter fraud occur. I haven't heard any cases really of voter fraud by mail in Rhode Island. There may be a few, but they're probably pretty rare. And I do think. There's a lot to be said for making voting inclusive so that nobody has to go through a lot of bureaucracy to get to vote. And I know that this bill includes an exception for people in skilled nursing facilities and in hospitals, but it would not include an exception for a lot of these retired people who may be homebound or who may not get out much and just do not have up-to-date ID and would find it pretty hard to comply with this law. So what I would and it is strange that we do require voter ID for people who vote in person and not for people to vote by mail. Some of us might want it changed so that everybody has voter ID. Some of us might want to change so that none of us have voter ID. But I think the sensible thing to do here is this is a very good issue to have a study commission on. It's true we have inconsistent laws for voting by mail and voting in person. If you had a study commission to re-examine the issue, one of the things a study commission can do is actually look at how often is voter fraud happening. Does it happen often enough to be worth it? And I would be very comfortable going with whatever a rational assessment of the facts say about that. But I don't think we've had that rational assessment of the facts yet, and I think rather than trying to arbitrarily move things towards the more restrictive side, it's better to do an investigative commission before a study commission before doing any further changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Randall? Thank you. Steve Brown from the ACLU had signed up in opposition to this bill. Is Tom Beresford here? Beresford? Tom? Okay. He had signed up in opposition as well, and that will conclude testimony on House Bill 5705. We do have written testimony from the ACLU in opposition to that bill.